Someone was kicking my hotel door hard enough to split the frame at 3 in the morning, while guests screamed down the hall. I knew who it was before I stood up, because fear has a familiar sound. When it wears entitlement, that was the moment I decided. Everything he relied on from me would disappear. I was asleep in a hotel room that smelled like stale coffee and recycled air. When the first came through the door, not a knock but a kick, loud enough to rattle the nightstand and jolt my chest awake. I checked the clock, glowing red beside the bed. 4 in the morning, exactly. The hour where nothing good ever arrives uninvited. I stood slowly because panic makes noise, and I needed silence. Another kick landed heavier, wood cracking somewhere near the hinge. And I knew immediately who stood on the other side, because no stranger carries that kind of confidence. No stranger feels entitled to break their way into your space. Only someone who believes you owe them everything. Only someone who has never heard the word no. I did not shout through the door. I did not ask what he wanted. I listened instead to the slurred breathing, the muttered curses, the way his foot scraped the carpet before each kick. This was not fear on his part. This was demand. The same demand I had been feeding for years. Disguised as help, as patience, as keeping the peace. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I started recording. Not his voice, but the sound of each impact. The way the hallway echoed. The distant sound of another door opening then slamming shut. I could hear someone yelling for security, and still he kept kicking, convinced that volume and force would bend reality his way. Standing there barefoot on cold carpet, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not panic, but clarity. 50. 4 years teaches you the difference between a problem and a pattern. This was not a bad night. This was the natural result of years without consequence. Another kick landed and I stepped back, not from fear but from decision. I called the front desk quietly and gave my room number, my voice steady enough to surprise even me. And as I waited, I understood something simple and final. Whatever protection I had been providing, whatever access I had been granting, whatever doors I had kept open for him, all of it would close. Not out of spite, not out of rage, but because patience without boundaries is just permission. And tonight, that permission expired. By morning, the hallway was quiet again. But the history between us was loud in my head. Every step back to that door echoed years of small concessions. I had married his mother when he was already grown. Already convinced the world owed him repair work for disappointments he never examined. I tried to enter his life carefully, offering support instead of authority, patience instead of control. And slowly that patience became expectation. Rides became access. Favors became obligations, and my name turned into a resource he could draw from without asking. I told myself it was temporary. That stability would calm him. That consistency would teach him limits. But consistency without enforcement only teaches people how far they can push. He learned early that conflict made others retreat. Raised voices got him space. Broken things got him attention. And apologies arrived before consequences ever did. I watched him cycle through jobs, friendships, and living arrangements, each ending framed as someone else's betrayal, someone else's failure, and each time I stepped in quietly, covering gaps, smoothing messes, booking rooms, paying deposits, making calls he did not want to make himself. I told myself I was protecting my marriage, protecting peace, protecting family. But what I was really doing was insulating him from reality. And reality has a way of collecting interest when ignored. The hotel door was not an isolated explosion. It was the loudest symptom of a long, untreated problem. I remembered moments I dismissed at the time. The way he showed up unannounced. The way he demanded answers immediately. The way no boundary ever survived first contact. If I hesitated, he escalated. If I questioned, he accused. If I said no, he rewrote the story until no sounded cruel and yes sounded reasonable. Everyone around him learned to manage his moods instead of expecting his accountability, and I was no exception until that night forced clarity, Because when someone believes they can kick down a door at 3 in the morning, they are not asking for help. They are asserting ownership, and I finally understood my role in teaching him that lesson, not through words, but through years of unchallenged access. This chapter of reflection mattered because it stripped away excuses, stripped away sentiment, and left only responsibility, mine included, which meant whatever came next had to be different, quieter, and final. I did not confront him after the hotel incident. I did not demand explanations or apologies, because confrontation feeds people like him. It gives them oxygen. Instead, I stayed quiet and started collecting facts. I asked the front desk for an incident report. Not emotionally, but procedurally. I requested the security footage window by window. Minute by minute, I emailed myself timestamps while details were still sharp. Because memory softens, but records do not. The clerk looked relieved that someone was being calm. That alone told me how chaotic the night had been. I learned that 2 guests had called security, that a maintenance supervisor inspected the damaged frame, that his name was already logged. I thanked everyone and said nothing else. Silence is unsettling to people who expect arguments. Back in my room, I listened to the recording again, not for pain, but for pattern. The rhythm of his kicks. The pauses where he waited for compliance. The escalation when none came. It matched everything I had seen before. Just louder. I labeled the file with date and location. I backed it up twice, then once more, because evidence has a way of disappearing when emotions rise. I resisted the urge to text him, to ask what he thought he was doing, because that would turn documentation into dialogue, and dialogue was exactly what he wanted. Instead, I noted the time security arrived, the moment the noise stopped, the sound of his voice shifting when authority appeared. Calm replaces rage quickly when consequences enter the room. By late morning, the family messages began. Questions first, concern second, then soft pressure disguised as understanding. I did not respond immediately, because reacting too soon would make me part of the spin. I took a walk, ate slowly, let the adrenaline drain. Patience is easier when the body is steady. I reminded myself that justice is not loud. It is methodical. The protecting peace sometimes means refusing to perform it for others. I sent one message to my wife. Factual and brief. There was an incident. Security was involved. Reports exist. I will handle it. No debate, no blame, just truth without decoration. This chapter mattered because it marked the shift from emotional endurance to strategic restraint. From hoping behavior would change to preparing for it not to. And in that quiet preparation, with no raised voices and no ultimatums, the real consequences began forming, unseen but inevitable. By the afternoon, the narrative started moving without me. Family group chats lit up with concern, shaped like excuses. Phrases like he was stressed, he did not mean it, things got out of hand. Each message carried the same underlying request. Make this go away. Be the steady one again. I read without responding, because every sentence tried to pull me back into the role of absorber, the one who smooths edges so others do not have to feel discomfort. My wife called and her voice was careful, not accusatory, but anxious. She asked what I planned to do, and I could hear the fear beneath the question. Fear of conflict, fear of choosing sides, fear of consequences spreading beyond one night. I told her the facts slowly. No adjectives, no emotion, just what happened and what existed in writing. Security reports, footage, witness calls. Silence followed. Not disbelief, but recognition. She had lived with his volatility long enough to know when denial stopped working. Still, the pressure returned from other directions. Siblings suggesting mediation. Relatives reminding me he is family, as if blood converts behavior into accident. I noticed how no one asked about the door, the guests, the time. They asked only about forgiveness, because forgiveness is easier than accountability when you are not the one being kicked awake at 3 in the morning. Gaslighting crept in quietly, questions about whether I might have misunderstood, whether alcohol changes things, whether I should have opened the door. That one landed hard, because it shifted responsibility onto the person protecting themselves. I answered none of it. I simply repeated that security handled it, and reports existed. Repeating facts drains speculation of energy. Eventually, the messages slowed. Discomfort is that this chapter mattered because it exposed the system around him. Not just the individual, a network trained to minimize, to manage, to pressure the calmest person into carrying the heaviest load. And for the first time, I did not comply. I let the silence stand. Because silence forces people to sit with reality without a buffer. And I understood then that canceling everything would not just punish one person. It would disrupt an entire pattern, and that disruption was necessary, even if it made me the villain in their version of the story. What no one seemed to realize, or maybe what they avoided acknowledging, was how much of his stability rested quietly on me. Not loudly announced favors, but invisible scaffolding. The kind that disappears only when it collapses. I had paid for hotel rooms when landlords refused him, covered car repairs when jobs fell apart, booked flights he could not afford, and answered late-night calls framed as emergencies but rooted in poor decisions. None of it was dramatic, which made it easy to ignore. But taken together, it formed a safety net wide enough that he never had to feel the full weight of his choices. I kept access open because I believed structure would help him mature. I gave him my credit card for reservations, my name for references, my patience for explanations that never changed. I told myself that support was different from enabling, that guidance was different from rescue. But the line blurred slowly, almost invisibly, every time I stepped in before consequences arrived. He learned that escalation worked, that pressure produced results. That doors opened eventually if you kicked hard enough. The hotel door was just the first time Wood made the lesson visible. As I reviewed the accounts, the shared plans, the upcoming trips, I saw clearly how interconnected everything was. How many doors existed solely because I kept the keys. I felt no urge to announce a cutoff, no desire to threaten or lecture, because threats invite negotiation, and negotiation was the game he knew best. This chapter mattered because it reframed the coming action. Canceling everything was not retaliation, it was correction. A removal of artificial support that had delayed his growth and endangered others. And as I made a quiet list of what would end, reservations, access, financial coverage, I felt something unfamiliar, not guilt, but relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop holding up a structure that was never meant to stand on you alone. I didn't announce anything or issue warnings. I didn't threaten consequences or explain myself. Conditions invite bargaining, and bargaining was the only game he knew. Instead, I moved quietly and methodically, closing doors the same way I once opened them. I canceled upcoming reservations made under my name, removed my card from shared accounts, and contacted a few people to say I was no longer a reference. Every step was administrative, unemotional, and completely legal. Systems don't argue or feel guilt. They just respond to changes, and I changed the inputs. At first, nothing looked different from the outside. There was no explosion, no immediate reaction. But I knew what was happening beneath the surface. Confirmations vanished from his calendar. Access codes stopped working. Flights reverted to refunds. Plans he believed were locked in began to dissolve without explanation. I didn't monitor his response or wait for the fallout. I focused on precision, making sure nothing was left open by habit or oversight. Half measures create loopholes, and loopholes invite return. Every cancellation was logged. Every change documented, not to punish him, but to keep myself accountable and clear. This chapter mattered because it showed what real consequences look like when they aren't fueled by anger. There was no argument to win and no story to control. Reality simply reasserted itself. I felt the old urge to explain, to soften the landing, to make sure he understood my reasons. But understanding isn't required for accountability. Awareness comes faster when support disappears without drama. By the end of the day, everything he relied on from me was gone. My phone stayed silent, not because peace had returned, but because the rules had changed. And he hadn't realized it yet. The silence did not last. It never does when control slips away. His first message was confusion wrapped in irritation, asking why things were not working, why confirmations were missing. I did not respond. The second message came faster, sharper, accusing me of mistakes, incompetence, interference. As if the idea of intentional withdrawal could not exist in his world, calls followed, then voicemails. His tone swinging between charm and threat, calm promises that we could talk. Sudden anger when I did not answer. I listened without replying, because every word revealed panic, and panic tells the truth people hide when they feel powerful. By the next day, the pressure escalated. Family members reached out again, not with concern now but urgency, telling me he was spiraling, that he was stressed. That canceling everything at once was extreme. I heard the familiar framing. His reaction became my responsibility. His instability became my fault. I responded only once, brief and factual. I am not providing support right now. That sentence landed harder than any argument could have, because it offered nothing to negotiate with. No timeline, no conditions, no emotional hook, just reality. And reality terrifies people who rely on leverage. His messages turned darker after that. Accusations of betrayal. Reminders of everything he believed he deserved. Subtle threats about what he might do if pushed too far. Each one carefully saved, not out of fear but foresight. I noticed how quickly entitlement transforms into intimidation when access disappears. How love becomes transactional when consequences appear. This chapter mattered because it exposed the final stage of dependency. When the safety net is gone and the person must either stand or flail, he chose to flail, loudly, desperately. And in doing so, he removed any remaining doubt about whether my decision was justified. Because a man who responds to boundaries with threats is not confused. He is exposed, as his messages piled up unanswered. The power dynamic completed its reversal. He was no longer kicking down doors. He was knocking on silence, and silence, when backed by evidence and resolve, is stronger than any force he had ever used against me. The shift came quietly, not with an apology, but with exposure. Security followed up with a formal summary. Photos of the damaged frame, timestamps matching my recording, and statements from guests who had been woken by the noise. I forwarded everything to my wife without commentary. Facts speak more clearly when they are not coached. She read them slowly, asked no defensive questions. And for the first time since this began, she stopped asking me to fix it. That mattered. Because the story could no longer be softened, the night had a shape now. A documented outline that did not bend to emotion or loyalty. Family conversations changed tone after that. Less speculation, fewer excuses, longer pauses. People struggle when narratives collapse, especially ones they have protected for years. A relative admitted they had seen similar behavior before. Another acknowledged they had avoided confronting it because it was easier to redirect him toward me. No one said it out loud, but the implication hung there. My silence had forced truth into the room, and truth is uncomfortable when it has nowhere to hide. I did not demand apologies. I did not seek validation. I let the discomfort do its work, because accountability spreads differently than blame. It settles slowly, but it stays. He tried one last angle, reaching out through someone else, framing himself as misunderstood, claiming stress, promising change, but even that attempt lacked ownership. There was no acknowledgement of the door, the guests, the hour. Only vague regret that things had gone too far. I recognized the pattern immediately. Remorse without responsibility. change without cost. I declined the conversation politely and firmly, not now, maybe never. Because boundaries lose meaning when they are reopened under pressure. This chapter mattered because it marked the collapse of the old system. Evidence replaced emotion, witnesses replaced excuses, and silence replaced chaos. I did not win anything. I did not feel triumphant, but I felt settled. The way you do when the truth finally carries its own weight, and you no longer have to hold it up for everyone else. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, which made them harder to deny. Plans stayed canceled, access stayed closed, and time kept moving forward without my intervention. He had to find solutions that did not involve my name or my credit card. I heard through others that things were difficult, the reality was heavy. And for the first time, I did not rush to lighten it, not because I lacked care, but because care without limits had already done enough damage. My marriage changed in quiet ways. Conversations became more honest, less performative. My wife grieved the image of harmony she had been protecting, but she also found relief in no longer managing crises that were never hers to solve. We talked about boundaries like they were structural supports, not punishments. Something you build so a house does not collapse inward that mattered, because it turned the fallout into something constructive. Not just corrective. I still think about that night sometimes. The sound of wood cracking, the certainty in each kick. And the moment clarity settled in instead of fear. Canceling everything did not make me cruel. It made me responsible. It ended a pattern that was unsustainable and unsafe. I did not need revenge. I needed distance, evidence, and resolve. And I learned something final from it all. Patience only works when it is paired with boundaries. Silence is strongest when it is supported by action. And consequences, when delivered calmly and completely, speak louder than any door ever kicked in the dark.